Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Mary&Melissa Show. Today we are live here at the George Washington Marvin Center with the first ever DC Inclusive Capstone Conference. We have a very elaborate table of guests today, which I will allow them to introduce themselves. Sean, would you like to go first?
Sure. I am Sean Ullman. I'm a staff attorney with University Legal Services. We are the Protection and Advocacy Program for people with disabilities in the District of Columbia.
And I'm Mary, you know.
And I'm Melissa, just in case you forgot.
Good morning, Amy Maestera. I'm the Assistant Superintendent at the Office of the State Superintendent of Education, which is also known as OSSE, and that's the agency that manages the state-level education functions for the district.
I'm Nathaniel Beers. I'm the Chief of the Office of Special Education at DC Public Schools and oversee the special education services for all students who are enrolled in DC Public Schools, as well as a number of non-public schools.
Good morning. I'm Desiree Brown with the Office of the State Superintendent of Education. I am a Special Assistant for Parent and Community Relations, and I'm a parent of a child accessing services.
Excellent. So we have a nice variety of perspectives. Amy, would you like to share with us a little bit of the history of specifically DC inclusion?
Sure. Well, I think nationally, the history of inclusion really started with the passing of the federal law, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Mm-hmm. And in many ways, that was a civil rights act in the sense that it looked at and expected school communities to support education of all students, including students with any type of disability. So it was really about access and equity. Mm-hmm. And I think within the district, there's a history of some really good work on this issue, particularly in the last several years. We've been working hard with our partners, both at DC Public Schools and also at the Public Charter School Board, to really make sure that IDEA is implemented as it should be within the district, so that students are educated in the least restrictive environment, have access to the supports that they need to be educated with all other students, and really have every opportunity for success that any other student would have in the district.
Yes. That's a mighty big goal.
Yes,
yeah,
but it's an important one.
It is, very much so. And some kids fit that model very well, and some kids don't, and I think the fine-tuning is finding how to make the general ed classroom accessible to all and still give individual attention to the child that has that need.
Yes.
So why this conference in 2013?
That's a great question. I think it's because for us, we feel like we've made a lot of progress on, particularly around making sure that schools and the local education agencies comply with the law. Mm-hmm. And so we've moved, as I mentioned, toward educating students in a much less restrictive environment across the board. I think we're now looking at quality of education, and for both compliance and quality outcomes for students with disabilities, inclusion is an essential principle. And we need to understand how to do inclusion well. It's a term that's thrown about a bit, but we really need to understand the nuances of how to implement inclusive practices, and as you said, how to make sure that the adults who are supporting students understand what's needed right along the continuum for all students, and even students without identified disabilities. How do we make sure that we're educating all students well in the district?
Exactly.
So I'll just jump in and ask, just since we're at an Inclusive Schools Capstone Event, Inclusive Education Capstone Event, the term inclusion, just going to ask this to the table. What's your definition, table, of experts of inclusion in education?
Mm-hmm. How start?
Sure. Do you want me to start?
I guess. Well, I mean, I don't know if there is an official definition of inclusion.
But what's the definition that DC is using?
I think from our standpoint, at least on the planning committee, and what I hope I'm getting the understanding from the government folks is that we want as many students as possible with disabilities or of any ability or race or gender or all of the above to be a part of their neighborhood classroom or of their public school of choice and feel included and belong and be able to successfully learn in that environment.
Well, does this also come at the tail end of how the DC is trying to not fund more kids being out of the system, so we're bringing in a lot more kids into the public school system, so at the same time you have to kind of rev up and modernize the inclusive program? Because everything happened all at once. The past 2 years, you've been bringing a lot of kids back into the school system, and the school systems haven't been designed to handle a lot of what's been coming in. So I think it's part of the bigger picture that you're trying to evolve DC's educational system, but also the inclusive component.
Right. I think that the process has been very planful. So as we've been looking at the appropriateness of placements in more restrictive settings for students and really evaluating that, we've concurrently been building capacity within the district, both in the charter schools and within the DC public schools. So I think we do have the capacity, and we're showing that by some of the outcomes. I know that Nathaniel would speak more specifically to that and his efforts in that area.
Yeah, if you could. What have you defined building capacity? What have you been doing?
Well, so I think that, as Amy said, this has been a very deliberate process over the past 5 years, which is acknowledging that we've come from a place that had to focus on compliance because we couldn't even check boxes on time in the right way, and that if we were going to build the trust that parents needed to have and that our teachers needed to be able to have as well, that they could actually successfully support all of our students. And so that meant building in areas of strength. So it meant building out what we could do in the continuum support for our kids with autism, because it was a very deliberate, explicit curriculum that people have been using for years and that have showed great success, and that allows us to, again, think of where the student sits within the continuum of their needs, and that there's a period of time they may need a more restrictive classroom, but that they should be afforded that opportunity to move up and down the continuum of supports as the individual child shows us what they need and are capable of, and that we as adults can continue to push them and support them. It means that it's been about building out what we can do on the early childhood side, so building around the successes that we've been able to do, create around identifying children, but also then building those services in schools so that our early childhood and early elementary school programs have really grown over the past 4 years. And now we're in a place to think about what that means for some of our older kids as well in the middle and high school level. How do we acknowledge that we are in a place where we can do more in our local schools, and yet there's still tons of guidance that our teachers need, our parents need support, our students need support, and that this can't just be a single definition that a school tries to say, I'm a full inclusion school, but this is about how do I look at individual students and support them successfully? And how do we as a central office make sure that we're in a position to really provide good guidance to our schools so that they're not just trying to figure it out by themselves? And I think the OSSE DCPS partnership has made that possible because we can support each other in those kinds of technical assistance needs that our schools have.
Mm-hmm. That's a difficult situation because I think that what you want to call inclusive isn't necessarily being inclusive, and that's an area that I think that the DC school systems think they're inclusive, but it's not really the climate of inclusivity because you're not accommodating the child who has certain particular issues, and you can't change the overall outlook or the class size or the school size or the dynamics of not having an assistant in the classroom. And those things create a lack of consistency with what we consider inclusive and what's actually happening at particular schools. In our last couple of shows, we've sort of gotten a bigger picture that inclusion is not well defined in general, that there's no specific methodology, and we don't really know how to define it. So I think schools are allowed a lot of lateral in that space where there's no definition, and the parent personally struggles to figure out, well, I thought that's what inclusion meant, and I'd like to see more of this, or how can the climate be created so that my child doesn't feel so ostracized in that particular situation because the mainstream environment is really dominant. That's something that I think the nation is struggling with. Mm-hmm. Are you working with a national model? Is there such a thing? Are we working on some kind of, I don't know, I guess legislation to define what exactly is inclusive, the keystone characteristics, and how do we implement them? And
well, I think that you're right. It's complex and it's different for different students and different school communities. I think it's really about the adults who are in the work, and making sure that they're held accountable to both what's required and beyond what's required, making sure that they are continuing to learn and fix what they feel like they're not getting right. So I think it's a lot of different pieces that are in play. We do have at OSSE an inclusion policy, which was one of the first policies we issued as a new state agency.
Great.
And it's a good start. As you said, it's an anchor for which, a common definition exists, but the devil is in the details. So it's really incumbent upon both Nathaniel, myself, Scott Pearson from the Public Charter School Board, and all of the executive directors of the local education agencies to make sure that there's a continuous learning loop and that we are looking at evidence-based models such as universal design for learning, response to intervention, PBIS, positive behavior intervention supports,
Right.
And multi-tiered systems of supports so that we really build capacity and understand what is needed and where to direct resources, because it's really not always about needing more resources. It's about looking at the information we have and the data we have and saying, what are we doing well, like Nathaniel said, and then what do we need to learn more about and do better.
Do you find yourselves in a reconstructive stage?
Oh, certainly. I think we've been there for a while. I think we have, as Amy said, tried to take the state policy and define it better for our local schools. I think that you're right. This is about a culture shift for many of our schools. We have some schools that are really welcoming, holistic environments that want to do the right thing and are struggling with how to staff appropriately, how to use technology appropriately, how to help use different staff, social workers, psychologists in ways that aren't just about whether or not they're doing testing, but how are they supporting the whole growth of the whole school into a better community. And some communities are further along than others in this, and I think our job is to create a baseline expectation that we expect at all of our schools, and then push beyond that so that we can really do something that's more innovative and more successful for our kids at the end of the day. But it is a continuum for our schools as well. We have schools that are just in a very infantile stage, some of whom are resistant to the change and some of whom are willing to look at the change, and we have to bring them along together to understand that these are all our kids and that we have to own them as a community and we have to support their growth as a community.
Right. We also have a very diverse community.
Exactly.
And
Yes.
handling all of that is individualized because you have to go school by school, really.
Language by language as
Right.
well.
Culture by culture.
So I wanted to ask you about you. So Dan Habib was the keynote speaker. So Dan it's a great movie, and obviously he's a great advocate for inclusion. He is calling all of us who care about these issues to a very high standard. I wanted to ask you about playing that movie here. Are you afraid of, worried about setting up too high of expectations right out of the get-go? Are there things with some of these models of inclusion that Dan talks about, even Dr. Stetson talks about, that might seem a little sticky to you all? Basically, how are you going to go after the prize here when
The implementation.
the implementation, and you're beautifully putting yourselves all out there, and I applaud you for that.
Oh, well, I don't think the bar is too high at all. It's a bar we've already set in the district. So just from my vantage point, I think it fully supports what we're trying to do already. And the bar can't be set too high. I think that it's not optional to do less. And that's really the message that
that's
I share with
excellent.
my staff. And I know Desiree supports. She works with families that contact us and need support. And we all share the expectation that it's not optional to do this work and to do it well.
So knowing that some schools, thank you for that. I mean, knowing that some schools are at different levels, in not having to identify a name of a school, but who is here? what is the population that here? Was there resistance to this conference? What do you think is going to happen after this conference? Is there monitoring? Are you going to have like, secret people that go in and watch and with their checklist? I mean, what's, where's the rubber going to hit the road?
Well, I want to share the floor a little bit, but just from my perspective, the rubber hits the road on a daily basis. So we're already monitoring, we're already providing feedback and corrective actions. From the state perspective, there's a full monitoring framework.
What does that look like? I'm sorry. So
Sure.
you go into a school and
We do.
works, doesn't work?
We do a lot of different things. We do regular data reviews. We manage the state special education data system. So on a quarterly basis, we review performance data and outcome data and make findings as needed, and issue certain required actions in terms of follow-up for those findings. We also do site visits and monitoring, both in the public schools and in the non-public schools where we have many children. And so, it's ongoing. We do training, technical assistance. We will provide coaching if a school needs it or if it's requested. So it really is multifaceted. And then regulation and policy, which undergirds all of the expectation setting and the obligations that we need to set forth as a state.
One of the other pieces that I wanted to chime in on is that we actually have a new tool that we'll be launching closer towards the end of the month for a special education quality review. And one of the components is about how schools interact with parents, how they engage with families, and that will be a good instrument in order for them to gauge where they currently are and how they can improve. Our training and technical assistance team will be able to support them with resources and on-site supports as well as they're looking at how to improve the quality of services and supports that students receive, as well as their families.
Tell us more about that tool.
The Special Education Quality Review Tool, I didn't mean to really open that door.
No, I want to know.
It's been a year-long project that OSSE has been working with. We did a general assessment of with some pilot schools about with developing some indicators. We developed, I believe it's 8 indicators around whether it's parent engagement or IEP development, et cetera. And there are different steps along the continuum that schools can identify that we're doing this really well and we're not doing this quite well. And we're developing a bank of resources for the schools to say, if I'm not doing this quite so well, what can I do to improve on this? And it's a tool that OSSE doesn't get to look at. They kind of monitor their own growth and development along the way and use us as a resource in order for them to improve on quality. But it's been a project that we've worked really hard on and we're extremely proud of it. So it should launch closer towards the end of the month where all the schools will have access to the tool. They can log in with their own user ID and kind of pace themselves to see exactly where they are.
Show me the tool. That's excellent.
Yes,
that's
an excellent
really
tool.
exciting.
We worked hard. We worked hard on that tool.
That's an area where I think there's been a real gap. You know?
We interviewed LEAs, we interviewed principals, we interviewed parents, we did a couple of focus groups just to kind of see where people are and what they thought about developing these indicators, what they thought about just making sense of a tool in and of itself. And we're at that point now where we're about to springboard it, and we can see that it has a lot of room to grow as well.
So how far are we from implementing a PTA, a special needs PTA in every school, just a specific PTA for that? I know we've talked about this before.
We have talked about it. I think my focus is always going to be on the State Advisory Panel for Special Education. It's what the state is mandated to provide, but as a parent who served on the State Advisory Panel for a number of years, that's always important for us as a state. Now, as far as the LEAs are concerned, they have a little bit more ability to navigate about what works and what doesn't work. We have a couple of parents on the State Advisory Panel who are very interested in developing their own PTA. And that process in and of itself it has to be sanctioned by the PTA, it has to be sanctioned by the school in and of itself, so they're working out the kinks around that. But we encourage all families to attend the State Advisory Panel meetings just so they can kind of get their feet wet, they can understand what's happening on the state level. They have opportunities to meet with Dr. Beers and any other, they have featured speakers, et cetera. So they have an opportunity to be involved and engaged and take that back down to their school level. As a parent for myself, inclusion is not the way that we speak as parents. Inclusion was introduced to my family in a very different way. My uncle is in his late 60s and he has Down syndrome, and he's always been a part of our family. And as we know, traditionally, the law didn't exist at that point in time. So what happened is that they would institutionalize individuals with disabilities at that point.
Right.
So he was always around my family from the day that I was born. This is my uncle. And he's at every graduation, every wedding, every event. He went to school with his siblings, which was cutting edge for my grandparents at that time. So by the time my family, and I have a 15-year-old who was a 2-pounder when he was born, it was a no-brainer. You know, it's not about inclusion. That's not what we talked. We just talked about him as being Uncle Bill. So he's a part of the family, and we knew that when he was born, and we were able to identify that he had some delays, that this is just going to be what we need to do as a family. Parents don't say inclusion. We say family. We say this is what we do. We want him to be fully included, but that's not the way that we speak. He goes to the movies with us. He goes to the museums. He's on the plane, etc. That's what we do.
Right. And that's what we want our kids to be able to say about their school environment. This is a family. It's not just a place we go. It's a group of people that support each other.
It is.
That's why I'm always questioning why the PTA doesn't have that particular segment. Why isn't there one already set up?
So we do have some schools that have done it individually and have started down that path a little bit. They're not always called PTAs, but they are sort of a committee alongside the rest of the PTA that is starting to inform some of our schools. So we do have a cluster of schools that are starting that conversation at DCPS. We actually are just about to launch our first in a long time conversation with parents on a sort of focus group conversation to start to inform where we need to head next relative to budgeting. We're going to try it out, work with some parents, get some of the kinks out, and then I think about how do we get a broader representation than we currently have. So we're going to focus around sort of one issue in one school and see sort of what pieces work and are successful for the families and what pieces do we need to do in a better way so that we can have longer term success with our vision that we'd have something similar to the SAP but would get a broader representation of types of disabilities as well as types of different schools that are represented and allow me as the administrator and decision maker on the special education side in DCPS to start to have a place where I can float ideas and get feedback and have conversations as opposed to waiting until things are ready for launch and then telling people about things and really creating more of a dialogue.
I want to ask a difficult question. And Sean, as a lawyer, I'm sure you've been on the receiving end of parents calling in saying one of the big things is classroom size for a lot of kids with, and I kind of call them the newfangled disabilities. It's the ones that are not apparent. It may be autism, it may be any sensory issues, it could be emotional issues, and obviously our society thankfully has moved further beyond just providing a ramp or, yes, of course, Johnny who uses a wheelchair can access our schools. How do you plan to deal with the issue of size of schools and size of classrooms when a lot of kids are now coming out with diagnoses and reports that say this child needs to be in a smaller school setting, smaller class setting, but we all know in our hearts we want inclusion. How do you deal with that?
So I'll let Nathaniel speak to DCPS and the work they're doing on that end. I think on the charter side, we have a lot of charters which are quite large, and then others which are one building and with a couple, maybe 10 or 20 staff. And so economies of scale, when you're looking at the continuum and responding to that situation where a student needs a smaller setting, gets complicated. And so at OSSE, we've been doing, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of work with the Public Charter School Board to come up with some innovative models for specialized classrooms that are smaller in size and are very richly resourced. This year we piloted a model with Options Public Charter School for students with emotional behavior disturbances as their primary disability. We have a middle school classroom and a high school classroom. And the staff to student ratio, and I always get this, but it's 10 students to every 3 adults. So staff to student is 10 to 3. No, 3 to 10.
Right.
And that's one example, and we're continuing to look at other models where with different disability types and specializations, we can continue to expand that in the district, particularly on the charter side. I know that Nathaniel's been doing a lot of work on DCPS's side, again, to accommodate the students that need more intensive support. So I'll speak to that.
Sure, I think that part of this is that we have some really very well-meaning principals in our schools that are trying to figure out how to schedule their classrooms, build their classroom sizes, make it possible for all their students, and yet don't always have the expertise that they need. And we haven't, within DCPS, been able to support them and give them the guidance and technical support that they need in order to build their schedules in a way that creates the right success. So there can be a smaller class if you have a cohort of students who need a smaller environment that's less overwhelming. That there are ways to think about how you schedule classes through the day that mean that you don't have a small class show up in the cafeteria with 500 other kids. And that's the trigger that sort of sends the kid over the edge. But that is really about sitting down on an individual basis with schools and helping them understand their special education population, because often the scheduler may not be the person who understands that the best. Understand the flexibility that they have with the use of their staff that can create some space. So we have phenomenons where we have great reading interventions going on in our schools that some of our special education students need to be able to access, and yet we have to make sure that people understand that that's part of their special education service and the hours that they need, that that's not a tack on top. Right, so how do you sort of then create that extra staffing space so that kids are grouped in ways that create success for our special ed students, but also for some of our general education students who need additional supports as well, and that the label isn't the only thing that creates some support, and that we have to start thinking more holistically of the child's needs, and that's a different conversation. So it does mean sometimes having honest conversations with families, though, about the ability of a school to meet the needs of their child, and having some willingness to understand that that may not be going to your neighborhood school, but yet there's still space in the system to create an inclusive opportunity for you. But that it does require working together collaboratively to find the right school for that individual student's needs, because we can't do everything in every building, and yet we have 123 buildings right now that we have the ability to serve students in, and we really do have in those buildings a full continuum of support for kids with disabilities.
Well, that's promising.
Yeah.
That's.
Where are you going to start? I mean, so.
I have a couple places you could start. We could spend another hour here. I wanted to sidestep a little bit because this is part of. You have an incredible background in mental health.
Oh, well, thank you.
I read the bio, and I think that a lot of the challenges I have faced with DCPS is this is not a mental health facility, this is an educational facility, but the two are very close at hand when you're dealing with a socio-emotionally challenged child, and they do need the mental health. And so I'm hoping that part of your big picture is to pump up the mental health supports, and I wanted to ask you what tricks and ideas you were coming up with to help schools understand that the mental health is at the root of a lot of their emotional problems or educational learning issues. Because if you can't get it straight up here, you're certainly not going to be able to get it straight out there.
And those of us with mental health issues sometimes look normal. So, yeah.
Yeah, so I know that our educational system as a whole has been a little bit delayed in that aspect, not just here, but nationally. Yeah. So is that part of a national project, or are you focusing on DCPS in particular, or will we expect to see a little up?
Yeah. Are all the principals going to be pulled into a room and like brainwashed, like be re-educated? I mean, are they all over there? Are they? I mean, What?
I support that.
How's this happening?
Yeah.
Are you sending them away to some
We should do
summit?
an intervention of principals.
Yeah, I
And
mean,
just
what's-
put them
yeah,
all into
yeah.
one big room and then give them like a whole
Yeah.
dousing of
Inclusion love.
inclusion,
Yeah.
love, and change. And
Let
what do you
them
think?
answer.
I can leave that for you. I can start that out for you.
So I guess a couple of things that you've mentioned. One is that the issue of social emotional wellness is really intertwined with educational success. And you're right that I think historically there's been kind of a separate track of training, if you will, for educators that looks like this, and then there's a separate track for mental health clinicians.
Right.
And so looking at how to ensure that practitioners in the classroom understand some of the fundamentals about behavioral health and really designing instructional environments that support positive behavior and I guess, encourage it, and then understanding how to intervene when something's not working well for a student is really critical. And it is near and dear to my heart because that was my first career before I moved into education. And in fact, I moved into education because I saw just what you've described, that there would be students with mental health crises in the schools that turned out to be that really it was the environment that wasn't getting it. And it was much less about the student, him or herself. And so that's why I moved into education, because I saw it really as a natural point of prevention and intervention.
Right.
So that's always been part of what drives me. And I think that the work we're doing in the district, again, just as we're starting to shift toward quality from compliance, as Nathaniel was speaking to and as Desiree was speaking to, we're also starting to really drill down into behavior. Effective behavior support. What does it look like? What are the different models that work nationally? And giving, again, LEAs the opportunity to find the right match for themselves. So we had a conference last summer where we kicked off an initiative around effective behavioral health support. And we're also continuing that work. We've offered several strands of evidence-based support training, including restorative practices, safe and civil schools, of course PBIS, and some other models, functional-based assessment, all of those pieces that are tools in the behavior toolkit. The other piece I'm really excited about is we've been collaborating with the Department of Mental Health over the past year.
Excellent.
To look at we received as a district a systems of care grant, which really looks at, again, connecting all of the agencies that support children and families and figuring out where are the natural access points to making sure that behavioral health needs are addressed. So we've been working really hard with them, and actually we just applied for some funding, which we're hopeful to receive, and we'll move forward with even if we don't receive it, to do some training around nonviolent crisis intervention. And we're going to be training agency staff across Department of Mental Health, CFSA, I apologize for the acronyms, DYRS, Department of Youth Rehabilitative Services, and DCPS, so that we have certified trainers who can work with schools and school communities and families on an ongoing basis. And I think that, in terms of principles, I think the principles are, there's a range of understanding of mental health. I've seen some principals who completely get it and actually themselves come from that field. And as Nathaniel said earlier, it's a developmental process, and our job is to pull folks along, push them along, and make sure that people understand what should be available for students with behavioral health needs.
Can I just add,
Please.
don't forget your thought. There are several questions you've asked, and like a constant comment is coming to my mind, and I'm trying to figure out how to work it in, and so I just want to work it in here. I think the biggest challenge that the charter schools and DC public schools and maybe non-publics also face, I think, is with kids with social, emotional, and behavioral challenges. And so that's really where we have some breakouts today that talk about those things, and so I think that we're starting to have that conversation. But one thing that I would really like to see families to do is really push their schools at it, because I think it takes 1 or 2 strong families in every school to change the culture in their school. And if a parent really stands up and demands it, you have advocates who want to help you. You even have people at the government level who you can turn to and say, no, I don't want my kid to go to that segregated non-public school with a bunch of other kids with behavior problems where they don't have good role models. I want them in my neighborhood school, but they are going to have mental health crises in the classroom, and I need to know they're safe. And if parents don't feel that, they're not going to want their kid in those neighborhood schools because they will be worried about capacity and they don't want their kid to be the guinea pig and all those things. So it's important that, I hear you, it's important that families take the bull by the horns too. And these guys want to do the right thing. I hear the right words coming out of the right people's mouths finally, because 5 years ago I didn't. I felt like I was the only one sitting at the table trying to get people to understand what inclusion even was, and what functional behavior assessments were, and what a positive behavior plan was. And now people know the words, they have the right ideas. They don't necessarily have the tools, so hopefully that's something that OSSE and DCPS at the top level are bringing them. But it really does take families who are committed to the philosophy and the concept, pushing their teachers, pushing their principals, pushing the other parents in their schools to want this for all of the kids. And then the people above don't have any choice but to make it happen.
Yes.
So I'm going to hop in before you guys
Do.
go.
Please hop, because we're
Very good move.
we're breathing
I think
here.
Amy talked a lot about the systems pieces, and DCPS has been very involved in working collaboratively with OSSE around the Systems of Care grant, and we feel like that's got some real possibilities. It's brought up a potential collaboration between DCPS and DMH around telepsychiatry, which has worked in Baltimore to provide more mental health access within schools, because historically kids are not going to see their psychiatrists, and so how do you make sure that they're getting connected? And there are some other ways that and things that we're exploring as to how we might be able to draw down to DC. I think the training programs that OSSE has been providing to our schools have been really valuable for our schools who've been able to participate, and then it will be the issue of how do we spread it more broadly across more schools. We also have been trying to build system capacity, so we have social workers in all of our schools, and now it's about defining clearly so that everyone understands, including the social workers, what their role is in the building, because some come to it naturally and really are pushing their schools on this side. Some need some more support, and some have administrations who are more or less resistant to that change. And how do we create the collaboration? And some of that's around creating some expectations that we have as a central office, and have been very supported by the chancellor and her team in figuring those pieces out. We also have some exciting pilots that have happened at our middle and high school level, looking particularly at chronic stress and PTSD in DC. We know the huge exposure to violence that occurs for our kids in DC.
Right.
How do we acknowledge that that has a huge impact on their ability to access education? So we started the pilots last year and saw some really amazing data on decreasing truancy issues for those students, starting to see some performance improvements for those students, and are really excited about the spread that we can think about to address in ways that were set up to be done in the schools around group work, to really reduce the symptomatology that students are coming to the table with, that they have to be able to decrease their symptomatology if they're really going to access that education. So we're really excited about those pieces, and I think those are going to be the pieces that help bring along some of those folks who are more resistant to acknowledging that the change. And what I say to my team all the time around social emotional health is, you have to talk the language of an educator if you want them sitting at the table. You have to have them understand that what is on the front of their brain is in-seat attendance and whether or not that kid is making progress academically. And if you can start to tie your interventions and the services that you're providing to that conversation, then it's a different conversation that we're having, and you're going to get a lot more buy-in and support for the types of initiatives you want to do. But that's a shift of dialogue, and we have to change that dialogue a little bit.
I know that we're kind of winding down on our interview, but
Right.
I really wanted to kind of go back to Sean's comment and the fact that our state education agency and our local education agency values parents and their input. I wouldn't be where I was if Amy didn't have a vision for including a way to support families on the state level. But I wanted to stress the importance of parents and their roles at the school level. my son made me a better parent. He has an older sibling who is 11 years older than he is, and I thought I was very active and involved in her education and her sports, etc. But having a child with a disability gives you a different lens when you're looking at education.
Right.
And it makes you just a little bit more involved than you thought you were going to be. It's okay when you have a kid who is, on the honor roll and excelling just as they breathe. But when you have someone that requires some additional supports, it changes your attitude slightly. And it is parents who drive this. We can always make sure that the state education agency knows that we're present, but we're at the heart of the school system. We're there dropping our kids off. We're there talking to teachers. We're there, and we have to make the principals do the things that they need to do. My son attends a private school, and that's a very unique perspective. They adhere to some of the laws, and they don't have to adhere to some of the others. But he has a plan in place, and my husband and I are very dedicated and committed to ensuring that he receives the services and supports that he's entitled to, and to also think of creative ways in which we can support him. So, yes, 2 sets of books make sense for someone who can't carry books back and forth on the bus. Just thinking of simple things that ensure that they have the quality that they need to have at school as well as to be successful. So just, as we're rounding this conversation out, just thinking about the power that we employ as families, just making sure that, although we have the foundation, we have the support behind from the government folks, that it's parents who are driving this work. Dan Habib is a dad. Lisa Deeker, our second keynote speaker, is a dad. I'm a mom. That's my primary goal as a parent, is to ensure the success of my entire family. So not only did he make me a better mother and a better parent, he's made me a better grandparent. I have a 4-year-old who I attended her. She's transitioning into another program for kindergartners, and I'm there. My daughter says, "Mommy, I need you to be there. I need you to have the conversation so that we're looking at different schools because it offers a different perspective."
And that's what this is about.
This is all
parents.
about making sure.
So as this is transforming and we hear from parents and they say, it's still not happening where I am, and who do they call? They call you?
Yeah, they're welcome to call me,
They
for
call
sure.
you?
They call me.
They can call us too.
Yes.
Call you too.
They call you guys and say, we don't think this is jiving.
It's not happening fast enough, or I've been bumping my head up against
Do you have a
the
SWAT
wall
team
for-
you could send in?
Yeah, we would like to call ourselves a SWAT team, yes. As I mentioned, maybe not here, but earlier this morning, Nathaniel and I speak once a week, and we speak about the big, systems pieces, but also if a family gets to me or Desiree and something's not working, he hears about that and he resolves it. So it's at the individual parent and student level as well as the systems level. And we have similar relationships with the Public Charter School Board and others. So I think that's what's making it work. We all think that it's about all students, but also about every single student, and we need to fix what's not working.
Right.
Thank you.
Yes, thank
Thank
you
you
all so
guys
much
all
for
for-
this time.
Thank you.
For
Yeah.
putting yourselves also out there on
Yeah.
this issue. That is, there's artillery probably coming at you from all areas. Sitting down with us. We're parents of kids with disabilities. We've had our difficult times. Probably, she doesn't
have
remember. We've been talking for 5 years. So, thank you.
The radio show is a direct outcome of parents advocating for parents and
Yeah.
coming together. So this is a
great.
very special moment for us today to be able to talk to you one-on-one and to know that the work is being done and we're all finally on the same page and that we could start to see some real changes. 'Cause
And can
that's
we
a-
check in with you
Yeah,
regularly
sure, yes.
and sort of take a thermostat to where we're at?
I'd love
Check
it.
your
I welcome
engines?
it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Great.
Thank you both.
All right, thank you so much.
All right.